Hello, everybody. Just waiting for Amanda to join. There she is. Hello, Becky Brenchley. Hello, Buffy. Aw, thanks for loving Bone Cryers Dawn. It's Amanda!
Here I am.
Amanda with the world's coolest hair. I want a pixie cut. So cute. Hi, Buffy. Okay, well, aw. I'm like saying, I can't multitask. I'm saying hi to people. And anyway, but we're here to talk about Amanda, who is like we're like couples besties with her and her husband. That's how I met Amanda. It must have been like 22 years ago or something. Has it been that long? Oh my gosh. Yeah, because you came to my shower for, at least when I was pregnant, you came to my shower. So it's at least been 22 years. Okay. Anyway, so we met. Like, Katie's doing math. This could take a while. So my husband was best friends with her husband back when they were single gents, and basically we got married around the same time. I think you guys were a few months or a year after us, but we met and instantly, Amanda and I instantly clicked, and we have just done weird hair things. No, that was me. We have done so many cool things over the years together. We were like, Amanda and I were huge scrapbookers together. We spent many long Saturdays scrapbooking and our brains out. And we even like moved to a different state together. It was a little short-lived, but we had like plans of basically being next door neighbors for life. But we love Amanda. I say we because it's definitely a family thing. Our family loves the Davises. And anyway, and then Amanda, so she's also like an amazing reader, cook, writer. She's an amazing artist. Anything she touches turns to gold. And so you guys might not know her now, but she's going to be published very soon. She's extremely talented, and she's already I would say, pretty well known around the networks of where we live in the writing world. And anyway, so that's how I know Amanda. I honestly call her Amazing Amanda. There's probably one or two books of mine that I've written that as your name, Amazing Amanda. Or for some reason, I can't figure out where this nickname came from. I also call her Bamanda. So anyway, I have a very special place in my heart for this lady. And so we all know, first of all, what we're talking about today is Asian American Pacific Islander hate. And as you all know, well, this has been a problem for a really long time, but the pandemic has really exacerbated it. And it made big headlines last month with what happened in Atlanta. And Amanda, who I feel like you haven't been as vocal about it publicly. In the past, I saw for the first time was pretty vocal about how she felt about this and how it was affecting her. And so I wanted to do an Instagram live with her. I don't have anything wise to say here, guys. I'm just going to be asking Amanda questions and basically giving her a place to share her story. Because a lot of people, especially where we live, sometimes people like to pretend that racism doesn't exist or that they're not contributing to it. And I mean, I've definitely contributed to it in the past, just in like little ways where I didn't stand up for somebody when I should have, or didn't know what to do. Those are actually big ways, but I'm saying that everybody contributes on some level, and what we're going to be talking about what people can do to help later on. Well, Amanda's going to be talking about it, and I will be listening for advice. So anyway, that's my little introduction, but I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to say to introduce yourself before I barrage you with questions, Amanda.
Well, yeah, I guess I could say, so my dad is Japanese, and my mom is Caucasian, so I'm half Japanese. And
I should have said that. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
no,
That's
that's
why
okay.
you're here.
No,
Why we're
that's
talking
good.
about this.
Yeah, that's okay. So I guess I'm a third generation American citizen. So my grandparents were born here in the United States. And I grew up here in Utah, which is if anyone has been to Utah, especially when I was a kid in the 80s, it's a very homogenous society. So
For sure.
so a lot of my experiences growing up were kind of interesting and unique, and I think we'll probably get into those a little bit as we go along. So
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I forgot to introduce the reason why we're talking about this. Okay. Anyway, okay, well, I'm just going to launch into my questions. Oh, I wanted to mention to you guys that we are going to reserve about the last 10 minutes of our chat here today for questions you may have for Amanda. She's very generously willing to ask any questions you may have been a little intimidated to ask before about this topic, or just any question you have. And so don't save your questions till then, but be thinking of any that you may have. But you're free to, do little emojis and comments and heart attacks or whatever you want to call it throughout. But we will be saving space for your questions at the end. So without further ado, here are some deep questions for Amanda. Okay. First question. Are the hate crimes incidents directed at the AAPI community over the past year a new form of racism, or is there a history already present in our country?
yeah, so there actually is a very long history of hate crimes, hate incidents, racism against the AAPI communities, almost from the beginning of our country. So if you look back in history, you have interestingly enough, there are incidents that are connected to epidemics and things like that.
Oh, this
Which
isn't
kind
the
of
first
parallel.
time that
Yeah,
you
this
brought
is
it
not
up.
the first time. In fact, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there were a lot of Chinese communities that were blamed for different epidemics. Sometimes they were illegally quarantined. Sometimes
Wow.
their homes were burned down. In a time of crisis and disease, like this is not the first time we're seeing this. And there were things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded any Chinese for a long time from immigrating to the United States, and which is kind of unique in that it was barring an entire ethnic community, and then of course, you know, during World War II, after Pearl Harbor, there was Order 9066, which essentially incarcerated almost 120,000 Japanese descended people, and about 60% of those people were American citizens, and so. And honestly, we see often, especially with the AAPI community, that some of these things that happened early in the United States history have kind of carried over into our day. And I don't know if you've heard the terms of things like the model minority myth or the perpetual foreigner myth.
No.
These are things that have kind of perpetuated through our history. So the model minority myth is this idea that Asian Americans, because often there's a large demographic that are successful in their jobs. And there's also the idea that um, a lot of times the Asian American community doesn't say a lot about the things that they're going through. I mean, you mentioned that I haven't been very vocal about it. And I think that's fairly common, that a lot of times because of past racism, we're not comfortable, vocalizing it. And so because of that, there's this idea that Asian Americans are the model minority. We don't make waves. We don't cause problems. We just go about our quiet little way and not say anything. And so a lot of times some of these issues get overlooked, you know?
Mm.
And then as far as like the perpetual foreigner myth, this is founded in the idea that because of how Asian Americans look, we don't belong here. That people are asking, oh, where are you from? Or as we've seen in recent events, a lot of times people are being told to go home, to leave the country, go home. But we're from here,
Yeah.
Like I said, I've been, my grandparents lived during World War II and had and experienced all the difficult racism during that era, but they were American citizens. They were born here. So
Yeah, and
there's this
beyond that,
idea.
like that's enough. I mean, it doesn't,
Yeah.
and whether you live here or not, there shouldn't, like, whatever. But like, as far as like being treated equally as an American, but I don't know if you want to get into it now or if you wanted to talk about it later. But beyond that, beyond being like an American citizen, your grandfather actually served on the American side in
Yeah,
World War II.
exactly. He was a member of the military fighting on behalf of the United States. And so yeah, it's really interesting that there's this idea of somehow Asian Americans don't belong here. That we must be from somewhere else. So some of those things have just perpetuated throughout U.S. history, and they are very prevalent and alive and well, in our day to day.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, even some of the it's interesting, even some of the language that we hear from politicians recently, I've heard the word xenophobia used a lot. We have to leave behind this xenophobia, but it's interesting because the word xenophobia means fear or hatred of a stranger or foreigner. So even the term xenophobia doesn't really apply to us either, because
You're not a foreigner.
we're not foreigners. Yeah.
Yeah.
So even some of these political things that we are hearing are still kind of perpetuating some of
Interesting.
these ideas. So,
Hmm. That's actually, yeah, that's enlightening to me because it's stupid, but I never thought about that. That's obviously the wrong term to use.
right,
But
right.
yeah. Wow. Okay. So next question.
Okay, I'm ready.
What was it like for a Japanese American growing up in Utah? Which again, you mentioned, especially now it's becoming a little bit more
Yeah.
diverse. There's a lot of people from different places that are moving here and that have moved here. But when we were younger, it was very homogenous. So
Yes, yes, it was. In the 80s, there were many times, especially when I was in elementary school, there were many times that I was the only person in my class of another race.
any
So,
race at all. Wow.
right, right.
Yeah.
It was a little better through junior high and high school just because it was a wider range of students that were attending. But in the beginning, in elementary school, it was usually just me and my class. And honestly, it was a lot harder. As I look back on it now, sometimes I think of things, and at the time, I don't think I really processed the impact of some of these things. But as an adult, I look back and I think that was not okay, and that was traumatic for me. But I didn't really necessarily view it that way as a child. I was like, well, this is just how life is. So, to be specific, I remember vividly, um, and probably this was probably one of the hardest things for me to cope with, but kids would call me dirty knees all the time in school, and they would say, take a bath, you got to scrub the brown off your skin, or and they would call me dirty knees. Or if they found out that I was Japanese, they would, they'd pull their eyes at me, or they would talk funny to me as if they were mimicking an accent or something like that. And some of those things, and to be honest, it was really hard because we didn't really talk about these things. And
Yeah.
so as a child, it was very difficult to navigate some of these incidents, because I didn't really
Yeah.
know what it meant, and what it, how to react as a
And
child.
that, I mean, it kind of jumps my order of questions a little bit, but I kind of was curious about like that. So that's how you're treated at school, and like kind of this one person out, at least in your younger years,
Yeah.
still one of a very few in secondary schools. And I was wondering um, what the conversation, if you ever even talked about how you were treated differently at home, because I know you've got a lot of brothers and sisters, and you got a couple that are older than you, or just one?
One older.
So
My
did
I
he
have
ever
older.
talk to you about stuff he was experiencing? But I also know that it trickles down, and that you guys were kind of uh, even as a family within your family, because of what happened to your grandparents, that you kind of were didn't, I don't know, you should talk about it, but you didn't maybe talk about it as much as you could have back then because of how you were treated.
Yeah. Yeah, it was hard. We didn't talk about it. And so even as I got older, I didn't talk about it with my siblings. In fact, it's actually only been over recent years that I've started talking about some of these things with my siblings. But when we were young, we didn't discuss it, and it was very, like I said, it was very hard to understand as a child. We're not
Yeah.
talking about it, but these things are happening, but I don't really know what they mean for me. And why am I being singled out by, by other kids? And so honestly, I think that's why I want to talk about it now as an adult, because not only do I need to process these things and try and understand them, but also to remind us that we should be talking about these things, and it's okay for us to discuss them, because if we don't talk about them, I feel like they turn into traumatic events for us. If we can't
Yeah.
fully process them and understand them and talk about them, then they become traumatic. And I remember as a child, there was one specific event in class where, and it started out in a very benign way. And my teacher, this was probably in first or second grade, but I remember it vividly. And my teacher had decided that we were going to categorize children by hair color. And so I'm sure in her mind it seemed like a fine idea, right? But
Well, in
um,
Utah, you were probably like the only one with like black hair,
exactly.
in your
And that's
class.
what happened. And for me, I was very shy as a child. And so I didn't, as kids started going into their groups, brown hair was over here and blonde hair and red hair. And and I remember looking around and thinking, I can't be in a group by myself, because I was so shy
It's
that
got to
that
be a
would have
group.
been,
It's got to be
yeah,
more than one person.
yeah, that would be embarrassing to me. And so anyway, I remember I didn't know where to go, so I just walked over to the group with the kids with brown hair.
Yeah.
And which in my mind I was like, well, that's close enough. And and the kids were like, you can't be in our group, you don't have brown hair. And they were so, and honestly, I feel like, I'm sure my teacher was mortified that this little activity turned into a thing. But at the same time, she didn't talk to me about it. I didn't talk about it. I just like, but because I didn't have the opportunity to discuss it, I think it really stayed with me. And I remember it like it was yesterday, just feeling like I am the only one and I'm being shoved out of all these groups to be by myself. So I think, yeah, I think it's important that we talk about it and have the ability to process these things, you know?
Have you had to talk to your own kids about it? I
I,
mean, they don't look as they honestly don't look as Asian American as you, but some do a little. But I don't know
uh,
if if once people learn that they are, if things have come up.
yeah, I haven't, I mean, obviously we discuss it a lot, just because I want them to be the kind of people who are aware,
Yeah,
because they probably won't experience the same things that I will. You know, I have a redhead, and when Miles was when my oldest was little, he had blonde hair and blue eyes. You know, and I think. You know, they'll probably never experience the same things that I did, but it's just as important for them to understand them
yeah,
so that they can be so that they can be good allies to others around them, and so that they
yeah,
can also understand a little bit of our own family history.
yeah. That's super important. I think, yeah. Um, well, you've kind of talked about it a little bit, but what kind of incidents you talked kind of about what you experienced as a child? What are some experiences you've had with racism as an adult?
Um, Probably, I mean, I get asked, "What are you?" fairly often, which is not the nicest way to ask someone that question.
Yeah,
Because I honestly, a lot of times I am not necessarily easy to identify immediately as a Japanese American. And so people don't always catch that right away. And so sometimes people are curious, but asking like, what are you or where are you from? Um, it kind of just gives the idea um,
like
of
you're,
not belonging
yeah,
again. Yeah, yeah. And but like as an adult, there have been a few things that stand out to me. You know, when my son was little, people used to stop me in the grocery store all the time and question me about
like if
whether
he was your son.
yeah, whether he belonged to me. So, because he was very blonde and he had
Yeah,
blue eyes. And so sometimes I would blow it off and just think, oh, you know, people are just being curious. But sometimes people would push a little more and kind of try and dig in. And that's where I started to feel like, you know,
what's their agenda? Like what's at the
yeah, there's something more to this.
bottom of their
And yeah,
curiosity? Yeah,
and honestly, it's hurtful too because you know, if you want to ask me like, oh, you know, is he adopted? Like, you know, then I say, no, he's not. I carried him all 9 months and the full 18 hours of labor and and you know, but when people kind of push past that and start saying, you know, like, are you sure? And it really, it almost makes you feel ashamed. You know, there's a shaming aspect there that is very that's very difficult to cope with. So, and then, you know, and I've been profiled at the airport. I've been pulled out of line. Um, and 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 again, some of these things happen and at the time I don't think, I'm just like, "Oh, they're putting me in a different line." But then, you know, as I listen to, you know, airport security talking and things like that, you start to realize like, this is a thing, like this is really happening to me. So and even recently there was an incident with one of my husband Ryan, one of his work colleagues. She found out that she found out I was Japanese, and she made kind of a disparaging comment. And Ryan called her out on it.
good.
I wasn't there. I wasn't there for this event, but Ryan called her out on it, and she, and the interesting thing is she said, "Oh no, I wasn't being racist." And
She's
I
the one saying that, so it's like
right.
somewhere
Oh,
in there
so I
she
wasn't.
knew she was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's like, "Oh, I wasn't being racist" when my husband called her out on it, but I think I think actually, I feel like that's part of the problem is people will say things and then they'll say, "Oh, but I wasn't being racist," you know, and so I think it's very important to be able to acknowledge these things, you know, and when people, you know, I would never expect someone to be perfect in this, but when you
Yeah.
make a mistake, it's okay to acknowledge it and say, you know what, you're right, that wasn't very kind, and I need to do better. And I think that that is an important step
Yeah.
in eliminating some of these microaggressions that we see
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Um, okay, this is a big one.
Okay.
I know there's lots of, I don't know, I'm actually as funny that we've known each other for 22 years, because some of the stories you're telling me of like stuff that's happened to you, I'm like, I didn't even know that. And I feel like I know so much about you. So I'm learning, just stuff about you yourself that I didn't know before. But I do know some of this, but I'm sure I'll learn more stuff. But can you explain culture loss and how racism plays a role in the demise of Asian heritage? And I know culture loss, I know a little bit of how it affected your family from what you've told me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think culture loss is actually fairly common among Asian Americans. And I think a lot of it just stems from the history of racism in the country. For us, for my family in particular, so my grandparents, they were living, they were young, like young adults during World War II. And the racism toward Japanese Americans was so extreme during that time that I mean, they experienced job loss. They had their lands taken. Um, I know that my grandma specifically was not, she was refused a job strictly because she was Japanese, even though that she was qualified for it. And there were times that people refused to sell my grandparents goods that they needed because they were Japanese. You know, these were part of these things were part of their everyday lives. And so I think because of that, because of the extreme racism, there were a lot of times that um, I think my grandparents sought to Americanize our family as much as possible. You know, how can we fit in? How can we reduce some of the racism? And that kind of an action is definitely not my grandparents' fault. You know, I don't blame them at all for that. That is a direct result of racism. And so because of that, some of the culture that is so valuable to families um, was lost over time. And
Yeah.
I remember once when I was young, I remember asking my grandma if she would teach me to speak Japanese, because Japanese was actually her first language.
Wow.
And even though she was born here in
They
the United
were
States.
they first generation or no?
Well, it was my great grandparents who came to the United States, but my grandparents were born here in the
Okay.
United States. So they spoke fluent Japanese, of course. So but I remember asking her to teach me Japanese, and she said her answer, I will never forget it. Her answer was, "Oh no, we're Americans."
Oh,
And and I thought, and of course I was a child, so I didn't think too much of it. But as an adult, that answer breaks my heart, you know, because uh, she felt that she couldn't pass that on to her children or grandchildren because of how of how they have been treated over time,
yeah.
you know. And so that kind of culture loss is, I think it's common and it is profoundly felt in a family. And
Yeah.
so oftentimes, as an adult, it has been up to me to kind of reclaim that culture, because we as a family have not felt safe to claim that as our own, you know? And so yeah, it's kind of been my responsibility as an adult to say, hey, you know, this is a huge part of who I am, and
Yeah.
to try and understand it. And 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 I think sometimes I think, and I've read a lot about this recently, I think sometimes people, um, it's easy for us to ask ourselves if we are Asian enough to claim that.
Okay.
You know, I actually read an article recently that it's very common for part Asians or even Asians who are adopted by white families to for those children to ask themselves, like, am I Asian enough? Because the
Yeah, like then you
cultures,
just feel like you're kind of lost in the middle somewhere, I
yeah.
would imagine.
Yeah, and you're kind of somewhere in between. You're also navigating two cultures, you know. Like in my case, I'm navigating two cultures, and and so it can be very confusing. And I know in my life I have found myself asking that question too. Like, am I Asian enough? But I think the defining factor is I'm having these experiences, you know. Obviously, if I'm Asian enough to experience racism and discrimination, then I'm Asian enough also to claim this culture that
Yeah.
has been taken away from me through racism. And so yeah, I think that's been kind of an important part of my adulthood, is trying to reclaim that. My sister and I, we call it our Asian Renaissance, because we're just trying to reconnect with that piece of us that racism has
Yeah.
removed from us.
And I know you've told me you've been trying to learn more of your stories in family history, and that's even really difficult because of how people were treated. I mean,
Yeah,
we haven't come very far, but it was worse back then, and because of that, some of these stories weren't even passed down. You don't know all the stories
yeah,
like a normal person might know about their great grandparents or whatever.
yeah.
Like you only know kind of sparing details.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, even you know, I was thinking, even I remember when I got engaged, my husband's last name is Davis, and I remember thinking, I can finally have a normal last name.
Oh,
You know, and I was so excited to have a name that people could pronounce, that people wouldn't make fun of or purposely mispronounce. Um, I and so I was very excited to become a Davis because I could leave that behind. And it's actually taken me until just recently to really be able to embrace that Kano heritage, and
yeah.
to, you know, and to not be afraid, to be comfortable with it and to not be afraid to use it. And so, you know, recently,
I didn't know that you'd legally change your name
yeah,
until you just said something about like make sure you say Amanda Kanno-Davis, and like that's my legal. And I love that you've like claimed
yeah,
like not, I mean you've always claimed it, but like it's kind of like a gesture or something. Like I mean yes, it's outward, but I bet it really did something on the inside too, to
yeah,
be like not gonna I'm not gonna like be so glad that oh now I have an easy American name. I'm
yeah.
gonna claim this name again. Or like, you know, I don't know. Maybe you can talk about that. I'm putting words in your mouth. I don't know if that's how you
No,
felt.
no, you're right. I think that's exactly it. You know, I feel like that, you know, that name is a huge part of me. And it, you know, it connects me to my grandparents and all of those beautiful memories that we had with them growing up, and, you know, the food we ate, and, you know, those pieces of the culture that I did have, they
Mhm.
were really important to me. And so, yeah, when I went back, when I decided to hyphenate my name and do Kanno-Davis, I almost felt like I was taking back a piece of who I am and who my family is, that easily could have been lost.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I
Oh,
love you, Amanda. I love you. My
thank
heart is
you. I love
bursting.
you.
um, what here's let's keep on talking.
Okay.
What makes you most sad about the recent increase in hate crimes and incidents?
Um, So probably the thing that makes me the most sad, I think, is as I see on social media, I see a lot of people who are refusing to acknowledge that these things are happening.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, in fact,
I see it all the time, whether it's on
yes,
social media or not, like just in conversations with people.
yeah, yeah, that it's not an issue. In fact, I saw a post recently that talked about how minorities are using these things um, to cause divisiveness in the country. And they're claiming, and these people were claiming that it's just race baiting. And things like that are a little distressing to me, and it's kind of painful for me to read because I think not acknowledging that these things are happening is is a huge part of the pain of that non-white people feel, you know? And so to say we're using race to try and gain an advantage in you know, or to try and forward a certain agenda, you know, like these things are not political. These are realities. And so I think lack of acknowledgement of these things has probably been the hardest thing for me to watch.
Yeah, I would imagine it's just as painful or more painful as the incident that happened, and why you're talking in the first place to then just not be believed, or like, no, your pain isn't real. You know what I mean? I
Yeah,
don't know. So,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
okay. So, what would you like to say to those who claim that the minorities themselves are race baiting and causing divisiveness? And maybe like, what could people like me say when I'm like, I say things, but I don't know if I'm saying, I don't know. What would you say? And what would you recommend that I say?
I would say I think it's important to recognize that people in this country may be having a different experience than you. And that's okay. You know, I sometimes I think we're a little bit afraid to um, acknowledge that our country is not perfect. It is a huge blessing to live here, and I'm grateful that I was born in the United States. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are without flaw. And so I think to be able to recognize that there are flaws and there are ways that we can do better, I think that's hard. It requires a lot of hard work. And it also requires us to reflect on ourselves. You know, what am I doing that might be contributing to this problem?
Yeah.
And those are hard things to do, to admit that I might be a part of the problem, you know? And so I think I would say if we could just acknowledge that whether we like it or not, whether it reflects well on America or not, these things are happening. People are having different experiences, and denying that those things happen is actually what it causes us not to connect as human beings. I think that's the root of the divisiveness is when we minimize something that happens to someone, it immediately causes us to disconnect. And
Yeah.
so the only way for us to connect and to unite and to understand these things is the only way to do that is to acknowledge that they exist.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I mean, that's just like a principle that applies to so many things. It's like,
yeah,
if you suffer with depression and anxiety, the first step before you can do anything else
yeah,
to make improvements is to acknowledge that there's a problem.
yeah,
Um, Something I've noticed when I talk to people, and like last month when all that happened, there was or when I hear talks about people that are complaining about racism, what I hear a lot from other people is things like, well, I was bullied too. I mean, everyone goes through bullying. That's just like a
Yeah.
type of bullying. I was bullied as a child too. Like, who
Yeah.
wasn't? And for me, it kind of like reminds me of like the Black Lives Matter versus people that were saying all lives matter. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, that may be true, but that's not what we're talking about right here.
Yeah.
Like, acknowledge what I'm talking about, and that this is something that like, I don't even know if it's necessary. Like, it's for some reason, it's like we're trying to like be like, well, like the scale of like who suffered more. Like, I don't even know if that even matters, but just acknowledging that. I mean, honestly, I don't think I still think the bullying for the most part of people, like it's a different kind of bullying than racism.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
And I've had people say that to me too, where I'll share an experience and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, that's tough to be bullied like that." I think racism is a little bit different.
yeah.
I'm obviously I'm not condoning bullying, and we've all experienced that on some level. And so, but I think when it's racially motivated, we're on a little bit different level here because you're trying to remove something from someone to make you feel more comfortable, you know, and you're trying to, you remove heritage, you remove culture, you remove humanity, these are things that are taken away from you through racism. So I think, I think it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And the motivations are different too. And honestly, as I'm thinking about like acknowledgement and stuff like that, I just saw like Elise made a comment about people calling her a liar over Japanese incarceration during World War II. And I've had similar experiences where in fact, this was actually when I was an adult, and I was working with a youth group in my church, and we were talking a little bit about family history, and I was talking about Japanese incarceration. And she told me later that she had brought it up to her history teacher in school, and her history teacher said that did not happen. Things like that don't happen in America. And so again, acknowledgement. I think we're still at we're at the beginning step. The first step is acknowledgement, and that's where we still are. So acknowledgement is something we
got to get past that step, people.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
We can't get past that yet. So, yeah.
It's like infuriating for me to listen to, and I'm just like the white person and listening here. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But like my husband's a teacher, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like someone would say that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of like when like Steven Spielberg, like when he was first putting out like Schindler's List, he's like, there's people that didn't believe the Holocaust happened, and I'm just like, what? I mean, that's crazy. But people just, it's okay to acknowledge a flawed past and still have American pride and other things, and still believe and have faith in your country and the future of your country.
Yeah.
But if you don't acknowledge, then it's just kind of like burying. It's like you said, you have to talk about these things or they become trauma.
Yeah.
And whether or not you're the person that suffered that trauma or that are just like watching it happen as like someone that's not affecting, like that still affects society and culture and how people treat each other in general, and hate and divisiveness. Like, it's crazy that people are calling you out on saying you're divisive or just bringing up these things and like talking about it sometimes on social media. Actually, what you're trying to do is end the divisiveness by acknowledging racism.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So let's see. Would you say, so this is kind of interesting because now you're, as I told these people in the beginning, you're a writer and are I feel like are getting pretty well known in the Utah writing community. And again, you will see this lady, her name on books, Amanda Kanno-Davis. This is maybe where you first are going to meet her. I don't know. Some of you that don't live here. But would you say that there are issues with racism in the writing community?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard. Again, for me, I still live in Utah, and so our community is becoming slightly more diverse, but not not the way it is in other places. And so I think sometimes yeah, there can be issues there. And for me personally, the things that I've experienced, I have heard people talking about people getting book deals strictly because they are a different race, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people dismiss the Own Voices movement. I've heard there was one time I was sitting in a workshop and there was a conversation happening that where they were saying if I want to get published, I have to write about racially diverse issues and things like that, because otherwise, how can I get a leg up in the publishing world? And so that makes me squirm a little bit, because when you're talking about using race to get a leg up in the publishing world, especially a race that doesn't belong to you or culture that doesn't belong to you, then that that definitely becomes problematic.
Yeah, I was at a conference once, and I, as a teacher, and one of the submissions that we were critiquing was written by a white person, and it was very heavily about like another culture. And we had an agent there, and she's Asian American, and she like had to say, well, she didn't have to, but she wisely told this person in a kind way,
Yeah,
because they're and they didn't really, I don't think they had an agenda like this is going to help me get published, like maybe the
right.
person you overheard, but just for whatever reason was writing about this culture. And not to say that like you can't ever, but it's just like be sensitive, and there's like thought, there's like a lot of things you can do to be more sensitive.
Yeah,
Um, but she was just saying, when, especially because this submission wasn't just about the other culture, but it was about like kind of the plot revolved around like this other cultures, like how racism was affecting them. And it's like,
mm,
oh,
yeah,
that's like, so she's like, it's hard. You've got to be careful that you're not taking advantage of someone's suffering
yeah, yeah,
to tell a story of your own, because you are going to eventually, like, you're doing this in hopes it'll be published and you will make gain.
yeah,
So are you willing to take advantage of someone's suffering for
yeah,
gain?
right,
And I thought that was an interesting way to think of it. So
yeah. And I think it's, me personally, I would say it's okay to include a diverse cast of characters in a book. But I think when we start to speak for a culture or a community or a race that is not ours, when we start to talk about issues and we start to talk about, these personal experiences, I think I think that's when it becomes a difficulty, because um, I think without even knowing it, we can inadvertently forward a stereotype or an idea that is not correct. And so I think there's a difference between having a diverse cast of characters and versus trying to tell a story or speak about an experience from a particular community.
yeah, okay.
And also I think, one other thing that came to mind as we're talking about like diversity amongst characters, I think it's important also to remember that there is a very broad range of what people look like from other races.
Yeah.
I've had probably one of the most, um, I don't, probably one of the most painful things that happened to me is the manuscript I'm working on currently. I actually wrote the character, and this is a little bit of author vanity, I guess, but I wrote the character to look a little bit like me. He has black hair and he has freckles. And I don't know if you probably can't see in the camera,
Yes,
but
freckles on there.
I do. I have freckles.
It's not author vanity. We always put a little bit of ourselves into our characters, I think.
Right. But and one of my critique, I was in a critique group a while ago, and they this was an online critique group, so they obviously hadn't seen me like in person. But I remember one of the critiques I got was, there's no such thing as someone with black hair and freckles. And
There's some, I see tons of people.
And I think just awareness of some of those things, right? You know,
Yeah.
that there is a very wide range of looks amongst any race, you know, any culture. You're going to see a very wide range, and so I think those are some of the difficulties that we run into, and so just to be aware that that characters can have unique things. Sorry, white people, but you haven't cornered the market on freckles, okay? So I have them.
I got so many.
Yes.
And you have probably just as many.
Yes, I have so many. So I think just to even just again to acknowledge that there's a very wide range of what people look like, you know, and so yeah, I think those are some of the difficulties, the small difficulties that we're seeing, you know, in just everyday writing community events. So
yeah. I wanted to just kind of, because I've seen a couple questions come through, but I wanted to remind everybody that we are allotting a few minutes at the end. So if we don't answer your question and you really wanted us to get to it, just like put it again when we're going to open up to questions, because we might not have seen them all or have time to chat about them just yet. Okay. Let's see. You talked about this a little bit before, but let's get into it a little bit more here. What is the Own Voices movement, and do you stand behind it?
Okay, so the Own Voices movement is the idea that we kind of talked about it before, that the authors should only write things that are authentic to them personally, right? And I think it especially applies to racial and cultural things. And I do stand behind it. It's actually become very important to me over the last few years as I've watched this kind of gain momentum. And the reason I stand behind it is because, again, like I said earlier, are you possibly forwarding an idea or a stereotype that you're not even aware of? There are so many things that are so deeply ingrained in us, in our culture, that sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. And so there are a lot of things that could be said or done in an insensitive way.
Yeah.
I think also, I think that, and I've heard a lot of people ask, what if I get a sensitivity reader, you know, and to try and help me work through these things? But I think it's also important to ask us, not can I write this story, but should I write this story?
Mm-hmm.
And do I have the right to tell this story? Am I taking away an opportunity from someone who could tell it in a more authentic way? You know, and so even if you were to use sensitivity readers, there's always going to be the issue of, should I be the one to tell this story? And I know that publishers are looking for stories with more diversity, because I do strongly believe that representation is very important. But that representation needs to come from the correct sources.
Yeah.
You know, because yeah, we want to we want to forward as many of these diverse authors as we can. You know, I looked up a statistic. It said in 2019, only 7% of books published were from Asian American authors in 2019.
Wow.
7%. And actually
Um,
7% was like, I think that was the highest.
it had been a long time, probably.
Well, and it was the highest percent of all of the other minorities. The other minorities were much lower than 7%. So
Really?
yeah, so Asian American authors were the second highest to be published in 2019, but only at
But
7%.
at that much lower
Yeah,
number.
yeah.
Hmm. Wow. Have you ever, we don't need to talk about the books or like the specific books, but have you ever watched a movie or a TV show or read a book where something wasn't sensitive or was inaccurate and it was
Yeah.
painful or just frustrating, or like how does that make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it, I think I think we're making a little progress and it doesn't happen as often. But I remember as a child watching things. You know, there's a lot of Disney movies and things like that that have things that I remember thinking, why why are they making fun of that? You know, or why, you know, why are they I remember thinking there was one movie I saw as a kid. It was a Disney movie, and um, it had someone imitating an Asian accent. And I remember thinking that's kind of sounds like how my grandparents talk. Why is that something to be made fun of? You know, and so yeah, those kind of things they hurt and they matter, you know. And so I think I think it's really important that we tread that line carefully.
Yeah. Um, I don't know if we're going to talk about this or not, but I also think a little bit about like systemic racism because I hear talk like, well, I don't really think differently about that race, but when I would feel the same if I saw, I'm trying to figure out how to say this delicately. Basically, like, but well, there was some talk, okay, last month about like, well, why did that guy target that particular place to shoot all the Asian women, and like basically how a lot of Asian American women get like kind of overly sexualized in
Hmm.
stereotypes as well, but like sometimes you have to like dig a little bit deeper, and so sometimes it's easy to put the blame on like, well, maybe there shouldn't be so many that are, you know, being prostitutes out there or these massage parlors or this and that, but it's like,
Yeah.
okay, let's like rewind a little bit and see maybe how that started. And it's still like a huge problem that lots
Yeah.
of Asian girls are brought here as sex slaves in the first place, or how people even like struggle to make a living and
Yeah.
survival. I'm like, I don't know, just the stuff that plays into systemic racism, or like, does everybody get the same opportunities for education and making money, or like leaving this part of town
Yeah.
or going to college? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in general, or things that rub you the wrong way when you hear people talk about things.
Yeah. Well, again, I think the difficulty lies in our acknowledgement of these things. You know,
Going back
I
to
think
that.
yeah, I think so many people will say, you know, oh, well, you know, these things happen to white people too, or, you know, these, you know, we see these kind of problems, or like we talked about earlier, I've been bullied, and, you know, we see these things often, um, but I think we have to call it what it is. We have to say what it is, you know. And I've seen a lot of people who are very opposed to using the term hate crime, you know, because they're like it. All crimes matter, you know. I've seen that. I've seen that said.
Yeah.
All crimes matter, you know. But but yeah, I think
It's like, we're not talking about all crimes. We're
yeah,
talking about what just happened, this one.
yeah,
And this is a
yeah,
problem, you know. This
yeah.
was a
And
hate crime.
and the impact that these things have on a community is palpable. So I don't think, I just feel like we're kind of stuck in this acknowledgement stage, and I think as far as systemic racism goes, we can't even begin to tackle that if we can't even acknowledge that these things are happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to think a lot about that. Like that is the foundational step. And
Yeah.
people, we can't, whether you think you're a problem or not, we can't move forward as a
Yeah.
society until we all acknowledge this.
Right.
Or at least the vast majority. And it seems like it's still 50-50 or far below who's
Yeah.
willing to acknowledge what's happening. And it's like, believe people, like
Yeah.
I have the benefit of knowing you and trusting you and having a very long friendship with you. And so when you say something, I'm like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
Amanda's talking about this, you know what I mean? Like, and you said, like you've said in the past, you haven't said as many things, and the older you get and the more you've thought about this and thought about things that maybe you bottled more as a child, that it's important for you, even in your own life, to like say something. Anyway, so I've got a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to our attendees' questions. What actions can people take to be part of the elimination of racism in America? Probably acknowledgement goes right along with that for one thing.
Yeah,
But
that's like my top thing. Like first we have to acknowledge it, and I think it's important to remember, this is, sometimes when I think about acknowledgement, sometimes I have had friends or even family members who have been noticeably silent on this issue when I post about it or when I talk about it, and I think sometimes I wonder if political leanings might prevent people from getting involved in these
yeah,
conversations. But I think it's really important for us to remember that this is not a political issue.
yeah,
This is an issue involving our hearts and our souls and all the other pieces that make us human, and I think that our humanity will be defined by how we handle this issue, and so yes, it's so important to listen and to acknowledge, and I would also say to celebrate as well. um, it's okay for us to be different, and
yeah,
for me personally, I want to be able to embrace my Asian heritage. I want to be able to say I'm Japanese and not worry about what that means for me, and to embrace that culture, and I want people to celebrate with me.
yeah,
And so it's good that we're different, and we should celebrate those differences. And I would also say, it's always a good idea to, if you can support diverse authors, diverse artists, restaurants, small businesses. These kind of things, are always very helpful on a personal level.
yeah,
Um, but I would also say, don't be afraid to speak up when you hear something negative being said, because for me, my experiences are all based in microaggressions. I haven't ever been assaulted or even like verbally attacked, but these microaggressions, they matter. They're huge, and I think they are kind of the energy behind a lot of racism, because these are little things that each of us do in our lives. So when we hear little things, even simple things like people making fun of another culture's food,
I feel like
like,
lots of times it's disguised as humor.
yes, yes. There are a
Microaggressions.
lot of things like that are disguised as humor. And I find, sometimes I even have to check my children and remind them, they'll hear something, oh, do you know this culture eats this? And it's, I always try to remind them, you know, that we can't make fun of that. We can't make disgusting noises or gagging sounds because that is their culture. And it may not be something that we embrace, but it doesn't hurt us
Yeah.
to celebrate what other people are embracing, you know? And so I think when you hear negative things, and like you said, often disguised as humor, I think it's very important for us to correct that, you know? And I would say I think listening is important. When you hear these things, don't try and defend or justify, because this isn't about you. You know, this isn't about your experience. This is about somebody else's experience. And so to listen to that and to acknowledge it and to remember that this isn't
Like, don't try to defend or justify like the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I think that happens often where people will say, well, you know, I don't know. I felt that after the Atlanta shooting when they talked about how he was having a bad day, you know, and that was very painful for me to listen to hear people justifying, you know, this man's actions. It was just adding to a wound that was already committed against a community in pain, you know. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so I would say those are our first steps. Those are the baby steps.
That's all. But I mean, it really is kind of that simple, and it's a
Yeah.
little hard. I mean, you and I, before we got on this live, and we were kind of going back and forth and talking about like, what do you want to talk about, Amanda? I mean, we've talked about like, you know, situations in our past where we've actually worked together at two different places, two different businesses, and one of those, Amanda was let go soon after our boss realized she was Japanese-American. And it was one of those things, though, that he never came out and said that's why. But she was treated differently from the moment she was
Yeah.
hired than I was. I was the one who brought her on, basically, and hired her. I needed help. And not in that job, the job before then, you were the one to bring me on. But so there was like a lot of like suspicious things, like, is this it real? I really felt like that was the reason why, but he never, when I confronted my boss and like asked him, why did you let her go? He never gave me a straight answer. And now Katie now looks back and is like, I should have like actually asked him directly, is
Yeah.
this because she's Japanese American? I've noticed this and this and this that leads me to think that. And like, really? You're better than this, you know, like I should have. And it doesn't mean like I had to like call him out on the internet, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are certain situations that you can do that. That's fine. But like, this is just a guy that I worked with, and
Yeah.
like, who knows if he even had like a Facebook account or whatever. But like, these are things you can just do. It doesn't mean that you have to like yell at someone, but just like your husband did for you when
Yeah.
someone talked about you. Like, what is she, or what did she say? The girl at your husband's work or school?
Yeah. She when she found out I was Japanese,
Yeah.
she made a disparaging comment about it.
Yeah.
And
And he, you know, I can't imagine your husband like yelling at this person. He's
right.
not like a yeller,
Right.
but he said something, you know what
Yeah.
I mean? And like, that's the very least we can do to help people acknowledge, there's that
Yeah.
word again, like what we're doing. And I really wish I would have been braver and more mature back then, even if I didn't know. Because there's
Yeah.
sometimes those situations, it's like, was this about racism? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So like, ask, and then maybe make that person more aware and
Yeah.
acknowledge, because he wasn't acknowledging and like telling us the reason why.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
hope I've gotten a little bit. Anyway,
Well,
I've
I think
got
too.
places to move forward.
Yeah. I think too, you know, you and I have talked about this, you know, even I've been in situations where I didn't handle it the way that I wish I would have. You know, some of these incidents that have happened to me, I wish I would have been more forthright and more and have more courage, you know, stand up for myself. But I think we have good conversations happening now that remind us what we need to be doing, and that makes us braver and more able to discuss it, and we can advocate for ourselves better. And so, you know, I think there's always going to be situations where we wish we would have done better, but I think as long as we keep that in our minds and remember, and so that the next time we can do better, the next time,
Yeah.
you know, and then and you know, ultimately that's how we're going to diminish this bit by bit, is by each of us just recognizing it and trying to do a little bit better.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda. I love you. Okay. Love fest. Okay. Hello, everybody. There were some questions that if you want to repeat them again that were earlier in the feed. I don't know if I saw a couple of them come through, but this is your time to ask Amanda a question. And she hopefully can answer a few of them. We'll see. We'll do this for a few minutes and see how it goes.
Okay. Okay, I'm like trying to read these.
So, do you want me to read them?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm seeing this one. How do we separate authors who are problematic from their stories as readers? Can it be done by reading the books? Are we condoning it? This is really big on book talk right now. Okay. So I'm trying to.
They're talking about books that have racist elements and like.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm getting from this question is, yeah. So how do we separate the authors from their story? So I guess if I go back to what I was talking about earlier, with the Own Voices movement, honestly, I don't know if it can be done. When we write a story, we're not separated from it, right? We pour a lot of who we are into our stories as we write. And that's why I think we have to be so careful about tackling certain issues that don't belong to us, you know, because we're not separate from it. And so we really can't say, you know, this author wrote this story, but if we separate the author and just take the story for what it is, I don't think it works that way. You know, I think, and honestly, as far as like condoning it is concerned, I mean, obviously that's going to be a personal choice. I personally try to celebrate authors who are able to tell an authentic, diverse story, you know, and so that's how I feel about it. But I don't think it is possible to separate an author from their story, and yeah, I mean, you're going to have to make a judgment call. Am I supporting an author that shouldn't have been telling this story, you know? And so, yeah, I think it's just really important for us to all be able to get behind the Own Voices movement and support it. I fully believe that if an author is talented and they are working hard, they don't need to usurp other cultures or other issues in order to succeed in the publishing world. So
that's an interesting way to put it, usurp.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? I think someone earlier had asked, sometimes it takes a minute for the questions to come through, but I think someone earlier had asked said that they would like to know more about what went into changing your name, or maybe why you did it. Well, we can either talk about that, or here's another question that came through. Are you wearing your contacts or glasses? Or is this hard to see on your screen?
No, I can see it.
Can you see it? Okay. I can't remember
Okay.
if you're a contacts or glasses person these days or whatever.
I'm a little of both. It depends on how tired I
am. We're getting old, Amanda.
I know, we really are. Okay, so this one says, what are some things people can do to support the AAPI people in our community? Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that at the end. I would say there are so many, just in my community alone. My husband and I discovered a Thai restaurant that was recently opened here in our little tiny town in rural Utah, and the owner said that they opened it because there was nothing like that here, and so Ryan and I have been we're like, we're going to eat there all the time, and we have eaten there, and it's amazing food. And I think things like that that enrich our communities and allow us to be able to, celebrate uniqueness and differences is a great way to support AAPI people in our community. Like I said before, artists and small businesses and authors, I love to read, so supporting authors with diverse voices is important to me.
What is your favorite or like a recent read that you love? Can you think of like a book that you've recently read, or?
I recently read, not too long ago, I read Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. And that was, it's like Chinese fairy tales and folklore all kind of rolled into this beautiful story arc. This one character is just like traveling through these different stories, and it's beautiful, and my children love it. And that's been one of my most recent favorites. It's a middle grade novel. I read a lot.
I was going to ask if it was middle grade.
Yeah. I read a lot of middle grade, so I guess I'm young at heart. But yeah, that's one of my recent favorites that I just love. And as far as like other ways we can support, sometimes I think we get a little bit afraid to ask people questions about racial issues. I think some people are afraid to say, like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How have these recent events been affecting you? Sometimes I feel like people think that this topic is completely taboo, and or it makes them uncomfortable to talk about it, or they don't know quite how to approach it. But for me personally, I always appreciate it when people ask, how are you doing? How have these things affected you? So I think it helps us to feel seen and understood. And so I think don't be afraid. Like, don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to say something and ask. And I think that's a great way to support your AAPI friends and family.
Yeah. I know sometimes people of color there's like kind of a misunderstanding that they don't want to talk about these things, that they're too tired to talk. Sometimes they say that, but it's not these kinds of questions where we're asking about how they're doing. It's usually questions like, how is this even racism in the first place? Or like, explain racism to me.
Right.
Like, those are probably like, where do I begin?
Right.
That's
right.
Like, oh boy. But I think questions about, like, again, that kind of preface with an understanding of like that you're acknowledging it in the first place.
Yeah.
And then in that attitude, asking questions, I think, is a lot different.
Yeah.
So.
And if it comes from a genuine place, if it comes from an argumentative place, then it's not going to be appreciated. But if it comes from a genuine place, then it really helps us to feel like we are being acknowledged, you know, and these things are being recognized. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Any last questions? I don't know if it was Becky a while back that said she wanted to hear more. I'm trying to see how much I can scroll back.
Oh, about my last name.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Did you see what she said? I'm trying to find it.
I
I don't know
know.
if there, I don't know how much. Oh, here it is. I would love
Okay.
to hear the story and process of taking your name back. I don't know if there's anything more
Okay.
to say
Yeah.
about it than what you did.
Well, I mean, for me, so when
And
I
maybe
was,
for some of the people that joined late,
yeah,
she got married 22, however many years
yeah,
ago. Her maiden name is Kano. That's a Japanese name, and married a Davis. And initially she was like, oh, thank goodness I'll have this easy American name.
yeah,
It was kind of like a relief, as I think is how you explained it. And then
yeah,
just recently, you've legally changed your name back to Kano-Davis. And so
yeah,
that's what we're talking about for people that kind of missed that
yeah.
part.
So when I was growing up, my name was always a little tricky thing for me because no one ever knew how to say it. And I was okay with that. You know, I don't I don't expect people to just automatically know how to say my last name. It's spelled pretty simply, but is it the ah sound? Is it the a sound? Is it the ah sound? You know, like people are not quite sure. Is it Kano? Is it Kano? Um, and so it never bothered me to correct people and say, oh, it's pronounced Kano, you know. And but there were always people who took that a little too far. I've had people who have purposely said it wrong in kind of a making fun of it way. I've had people who have brushed it off and then proceeded to say it the wrong way, you know, because they didn't really listen to how I was telling them to pronounce it. I don't think it's that difficult of a name to pronounce, but it has been an issue. And yes, when I got married, I was very excited to just be a Davis. Nobody will ever ask me how to say my last name again. But over the years, I think, you know, we talked earlier about about it being very important for me to take back my Japanese heritage and to kind of replace that culture loss. And the more I feel connected to it, the more I realize, you know, this name is important to me. It represents a big part of who I am. And so you know, after just thinking about it for a long time, I just decided, you know, that would be a really great way for me to remember um, the culture that I come from and the heritage that I come from, and to remember who I really am. And I wanted to hyphenate it because being a Davis has also been an important part of who I am. So it was, I just really wanted to kind of combine those two names and kind of own them to, as just as a reminder to me that this is a
Who
big
you
part
are.
of who I am.
Yeah.
And also that I don't need to hide behind an American name either. That I don't have to be ashamed of that culture, regardless of things that have happened to me, you know, in my life. So.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
Thank you.
All right. Any last questions, people? Amanda, do you have do you have a last message to share with everybody?
Yeah, I would just say, just, I guess my final message would be that the small things matter. You know, we've talked about a lot of little things. Like I said, I haven't experienced anything, um, like I've never been physically threatened. I've never been verbally abused, but, um, these things we call them microaggressions, they matter. They are a big deal. And they fuel a lot of the racism that is alive and well in the country. And so I would just say it's so important for us to remember that these small things matter. Words matter. Small actions matter. I think, you know, in recent years, we have seen the impact that words can have in this country. Um, and and it's so important for us to be careful about how we speak of other cultures and other races, how we act around them, how we try to protect them. You know, these little things, how we support and celebrate and acknowledge, all of those things, they do matter, and they may not seem like a big deal, but they do. And I feel like it all starts with those small things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. For me, I mean, the majority of these things, like I've known, like, yeah, but like the way you've put things, it really has made me think a lot harder about how it begins with acknowledgement, just ownership, of that there's a problem, and even on a small scale, acknowledgement,
Yeah.
and that healing and unity, these things can't happen unless we get past the stage of acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And it's okay we can still love our country and our state and our neighborhood and our actual neighbor or whoever has done racist things, but still acknowledge that there's a problem, and ask for change. And it starts at that small level. And I also loved, oh, look at Wendy, Lady 29. By small and simple things, great things are brought to pass. Beautiful.
Hey,
and I
Mom.
also, that's her mom.
That's my mom,
I was going to be cool and not say that, but good job, Mom. But I also really loved what you said about how racism is different than bullying. And for like the half of these people that joined late in the game, do you mind just kind of articulating that one more time? Because that's something that I'm going to really think about a lot more too.
Yeah.
Because we were kind of just talking about how, like, on some level, like all of us probably are like, well, I've had hard things happen to me before too in my past. Like, you know, we all go through hard things and get bullied, and like this is just a part of life, right? They're calling it racism, but it's just human nature, you know.
Right.
I don't know. And you were saying it's you think it's a different, racism is on a different level than bullying.
Yeah, I think, I mean, all of us have experienced some level of bullying in our lives, and we all know what that feels like. It's not a pleasant thing. I think racism comes from a different place, than bullying. I think racism, comes from a place of, insecurity and discomfort from the person who is exhibiting that racism. Because what they're trying to do, I feel, is they're trying to, make you more palatable to them.
Yeah, and they're stripping away your identity.
Yeah. So when an act of racism happens, it removes our culture, it removes our heritage, from us, and it really strips that away. And I have definitely felt the effects of that in my own family. That there's so much loss there because of racism, and I've had to consciously take that back for myself in order to combat, you know, the effects of that kind of racism.
Yeah. And again, you were just saying earlier how, because you're like third generation Japanese American. I think you're like you're half Japanese though, right? Like your dad,
Yes.
like, as far
Yeah.
as like blood or whatever.
Right.
But you talked about how, like, am I Asian enough that I can be like, this racism hurts me?
Yeah.
Or like where it's stuff that's just like you hear in the news or whatever, or that I can be, I mean, it does, but like, you know, you just kind of had that, you kind of felt in the middle sometimes of like, am I Asian enough? Am I American enough? Am I like, what am I?
Yeah.
When people have asked you that question your whole life. But then
Right.
on the flip side of it, like, we're not just talking about like the racism you've experienced, but you also wanted to talk about, like, I'm just reiterating some of our conversations.
Yeah.
celebrating the difference too, like
Yes.
celebrating the things that you've experienced, but like racism about,
Right.
but actually claiming those differences. I mean,
Yeah. I know.
so
I'm not, I definitely don't want to be, um, I don't want to be like assimilated into this idea, so there's a balance between acceptance and feeling a part of a community, but also being able to maintain the culture and the heritage that's important to me. So,
yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, there's a little question you can just give a really quick answer
oh,
because you kind
okay.
of talked about it earlier. But they said, "Do you speak Japanese? If not, would you ever want to learn?" And they said that they tried for a while, but it's so hard.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a different, it's very different from our language, but I don't speak Japanese. I know a lot of food names because food was one piece of our culture that my grandma really brought us into, and so we always like on January 1st we did a Japanese New Year and had a huge feast, and and all the foods were there and I loved it, and I cook a lot of the food still with my kids, and my grandma before she passed away actually made me a handwritten recipe book with all her recipes in her words and her descriptions, and it's one of the most valuable things that I have. So I know a lot of food names, but I'm actually taking a class in the fall to start learning Japanese because
Ooh,
I feel like that's my next step in reclaiming my Japanese heritage.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Well, we still make your teriyaki chicken. That was your
yay.
grandma's recipe.
Yes.
The only good kind. And I've learned all about the right kind of soy sauce to buy from you.
Yes. And you gotta get,
Kikoman.
yeah, and you gotta get the right kind of rice, and yeah.
Anyway, okay. Amanda, amazing Amanda, I love ya. And
I
thanks
love
so
you.
much for coming here to share your experience, your reality, your pain, your joy, your advice, your warnings, yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Katie. I love you. You're the
I love
best.
it
Thank
too.
you. This was a great
And
opportunity.
I think this will be on my story for 24 hours. And I think I just realized I can put it, I'm not the best with Instagram, but I think I can put it on my highlights reel. I just discovered. And then I think it's kind of stays longer. Anyway,
Okay.
so I'll do that in case any of you wanted to go back to the beginning or share this with a friend. And remember the name, Amanda Kanno-Davis. You will soon see it on every award-winning book.
Yes,
Not
that's
every
cool.
book, but it'll be in a
That's
bookstore.
oh, thank you, Katie.
Okay. All right. Love you so much. See you later.
Bye.